the RCEP issue in the context of Thailand's role as ASEAN chair this year. Thailand's clearly desperately looking for some wins, including both possibly on the trade front, but also the big discussions going on about an ASEAN version of the Indo-Pacific outlook, some sort of answer to US pressure, perhaps to take more sides. Do you think Thailand's capable of pulling off some sort of victories and also at least moving the agenda forward on the trade front, not just for Thailand itself, but ASEAN? Is that a messy question?
No, it's a very valid question. I think for Thailand, there's a lot of anticipation about the Thai chairmanship of ASEAN this year. We're now mid-year, just about mid-year now. We still don't have a new government. We barely have a new prime minister, who is a former one. And a lot of questions about what will happen going forward. So the theme for the chairmanship is, advancing partnership for sustainability, which is a very kind of a broad, overarching theme. It's a no-lose theme. It's a risk-averse theme. You can fit everything into that. I think that the chairmanship of Thailand will be kind of a risk-averse, minimalist chair. For example, I think we have the ASEAN summit coming up already. We don't have a new foreign minister yet, so it looks like we'll have an acting government conducting the first round of the summit. And then by October, November, the real big summit season, I think we'll have a new government by then. But the key will be who will be looking after the foreign ministry. Ministry of Foreign Affairs will be key. So we hope that we'll have capable hands. And this government will enjoy some legitimacy, despite all of the shortcomings and misgivings that we can talk about, how they came to power. But there has been an election in Thailand with all of its flaws and everything else. But internationally, I think that this will be a stark contrast to the previous government of the last 5 years, which has zero democratic legitimacy. So that will help Thailand as a chair. They at least won't have to spend most of the time trying to explain why there has been a coup, when the next election will be. That is a big space to work with already when you go abroad. Now for ASEAN, let me just add a little bit. I didn't cover ASEAN much, but just building on what Danny and Dr. Somkiat have talked about. We've talked about ASEAN as a monolith, as a kind of a very cohesive, self-contained entity. But in fact, it is not. I think ASEAN is facing challenges, I think, from the past. Is becoming more fractured, more fragmented. I would say that we should be very happy that we have ASEAN. We should be relieved and grateful that we have ASEAN, because ASEAN is a fallback, is a cushion in times of tension, confrontation, uncertainty, and which is likely to get worse. So for an internal market, if it can be harnessed of 646 million people and 2.9, almost 3 trillion GDP, with established organization for 52 years, that's a big, major cushion, comfort level that we can work with. If the world goes bad and we have to be stuck here in Southeast Asia, not a bad place to be stuck in. ASEAN is an organization that really counts a lot more now for Thailand in this kind of world. Having said that, I think it's not self-contained, monolithic anymore. It's been fragmented, divided by China. China has a virtual veto on ASEAN. When it wants to press a button, it presses the Cambodia button, and it gets the results it wants. And China knows this. And the US now may be following in the footsteps of China, which is to maybe force ASEAN to choose, ASEAN members to choose. So if they come around and say, hey, Thailand, you're a treaty ally. Philippines, you're a treaty ally. Don't use Huawei. This would be a difficult choice for Thailand as a treaty ally, because Huawei technology is good, and China is a very, very close, intimate, centuries-old, millennium-old partner. So it's tough for ASEAN. For Thailand in that space. RCEP is not a real gold standard trade liberalization vehicle. is good as a kind of a preliminary, maybe building blocks to a more genuine liberalizations, like issues of behind the borders, a lot of issues with services, and I think RCEP has a big problem because it does not include the United States, and the United States will not take that favorably, especially under the Trump administration, and most likely that they will do whatever they can to make sure that the RCEP doesn't reach a expeditious, successful conclusion. And RCEP in recent years become more political than economic than trade to me. CPTPP, however, is a genuine trade liberalization vehicle, and I think that now with elected government, such as it is, there is space for trade policy revival. I think that they will start considering EU FTA again, and maybe even a revamp TAFTA, Thai-Australia, and I think that there are a lot of policy elites on trade that want to join CPTPP, and I think some partners, perhaps Australia, would like to see Thailand join CPTPP. So it's a good time to do it. At least, I mean, the elections, we have a lot of issues, but there's some upside to it. There's some upside to it. Our diplomats will not have to spend so much time explaining why there's been a coup and no election. Our trade policy experts now can start thinking about moving forward on trade policy again. So I think I'm optimistic in that way. I have two questions about ASEAN. So on the one hand, we're so relieved and grateful that we have ASEAN, right, in this neighborhood. And ASEAN integration, a lot of it is happening on the investment side, on the intra-investment side. There's connectivity on the ground more in mainland Southeast Asia than the whole of ASEAN. I see integration in banking. You can see a lot of migrant laborers from Myanmar, Cambodia. You go to the ATM machine, and you look at the language on the ATM screen. It's in English, of course. It's in Chinese, of course, but it's also in Cambodian and Myanmar. So a lot of workers from nearby countries. So you see some banking integration. I think labor integration, healthcare integration in mainland Southeast Asia, especially. So that's a good prospect for us. Two questions I have about ASEAN is, now that we have it, we're grateful. How do we keep it as such? And what do we do with it? ASEAN now is challenged by the major powers, the big powers. And the big powers, when they're having a big fight like this, as Lee Kuan Yew, the great Lee Kuan Yew, the late Lee Kuan Yew said, well, when the elephants have a big fight, the ground shakes and everybody suffers. For ASEAN to maintain the cohesion, not to be divided on the South China Sea, for example, is a big challenge. And I think China has divided ASEAN, I have to say. And then, if you can maintain cohesion, you have to address, behind border issues on politics. There's a rising authoritarianism in ASEAN. Cambodia elected dictatorship, Thailand kind of elected military authoritarian rule, I would say, of sorts. Vietnam, Laos, Brunei, even creeping Islamism into a bit in Indonesia. So the fabric of democracy, the rights and freedoms that are attendant, that are part and parcel of being a open, forward-looking democracy, has been eroded, and giving rise to authoritarianism in different countries. So this rising authoritarianism works well, plays into the hands of China, and I think China now provides a self-contained model of government and economic management that stands itself apart from the US-based, European, and so on. And it's formidable. Why not have the cake and eat it too? Centralized control, dynamic economy. And that's something I think ASEAN have to think about, And then if it can maintain cohesion and not be picked apart, and then what do we do with it? So we have to really reboot and reboost the various pronouncements, the ASEAN Economic Community hasn't gone anywhere. The ASEAN Free Trade hasn't risen, about 24% over the last 2 decades. So investment, I think we have a lot of space. And then the consumption, so I think some tourism. So, keeping it, doing something with it in an adverse global environment, that's ASEAN challenge. The Indo-Pacific is going to be problematic for ASEAN because the US is going to push that very hard, and they call it the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. It's not just a concept, it's a strategy. The US is going to use this strategy to counter China's BRI and other schemes, and for ASEAN, it's a lot to handle. So ASEAN is trying to ASEANize FOIP by calling it a concept, framework, idea, thing, whatever, but not a strategy. Because if FOIP becomes a strategy, it's going to overwhelm the region.
Thank you. There's actually a lot of thoughts in that. Before I perhaps turn it to you, Danny, with some thoughts on any of those points.
Sure.
But I just thought I'd add a little bit for thought. In the recent Shangri-La dialogue, IISS Shangri-La dialogue, we saw, in my view, it was a very kind of old-fashioned thing, very focused on the generals and military power as a notion of a way that, both regional response and challenge was very much in that military view of firepower. But as we've charted so well here, the big challenges are broadly economic. The free and open Indo-Pacific pushed by the US is even focusing on development, finance, infrastructure, trying to counter China's reach with BRI. So, in fact, this also shows a big power kind of cozying up to the region and also trying to win them over with these kind of broader initiatives, economic assistance, etc. So, can we also assume that, in a way, they also need the region as much as the region needs them? So we've got, I think you had...
I had some thoughts on exactly that, but perhaps I can pick up first where Dr. Somkiat went and then also address some of the challenging issues that Jay has raised. First, maybe as a bit of an ivory tower academic, I like very much the test that Dr. Somkiat has set for us. He says RCEP and whether it will happen is the acid test for whether ASEAN can actually ever have a hope of being united, taking a leadership role. I like these kinds of tests because there's a clear outcome. It's like the canary in the coal mine. Either the canary survives or it dies, and there is no uncertainty about that. So you're applying this to RCEP, and Jay has picked up on the idea and expanded it to how ASEAN is such a difficult animal to deal with. Our colleague Bilahari says that, you want to think about ASEAN as the right kind of animal, certain things it will never achieve, let's be satisfied with what it does get. Let me say that, 5 years ago, I came to this building, and Jay and I had an exchange on ASEAN. And at that point, I was very pessimistic about ASEAN. Maybe because I now live in the region, I've become optimistic. I do think ASEAN can survive the canary test, and I do think we can take it forwards. And, as Gwen says, provide a third way, an alternative to the great power competition. So why am I optimistic? Why do I think it might survive? If we apply this thinking to RCEP, you have to remember RCEP, the trade partnership, it will, if it comes to fruition, be a wonderful thing. It's not gold standard the way TPP is. The standards for trading will not be so high that everyone, it is clean, but it's a small step along the way. And that small step along the way is an acknowledgement that RCEP is not just a regional public good. It is a decision-making process. It's a decision-making process where each individual potential member state still has to think through costs and benefits to joining this. So it is a very different kind of collective action than, say, organizing all of us on a sustainability challenge or on a haze challenge. It is about trying to bring everyone along. So the reason that we are now at RCEP rather than at TPP or even CPTPP is one thing and one thing alone, is that RCEP allows special and differential treatment depending on whether someone is a Cambodia or Laos and one's infrastructure and income is not as high as Singapore's. There's special and differential treatment. This moves it away from the gold standard prospects, but it also makes it more palatable to the coalition to sign up to it. So I'm actually still quite hopeful that we can jiggle that and make it happen. But where, for me, the real canary test is can ASEAN get together and solve a real public goods problem? The haze issue is, for me, one of them. Sustainability and the environment is another. So while we have these developments on trade, we have to keep an eye on how it is quite separate from the kind of leadership role I still believe ASEAN and Thailand can take. Thailand is the second largest economy in ASEAN. It is 16% of total ASEAN GDP. It is a huge chunk that can move the other nation states along with it. So I'm hopeful on this. I'm also hopeful that ASEAN will not simply be torn apart, picked on individually by the great powers. And why do I think that? It seems to fly in the face of the common sense idea that, as you correctly point out, Kuan had espoused, that when the elephants fight, all the other animals get trampled on. Or another saying by Thucydides. Thucydides, in reflecting on what was happening among city-states in ancient Greece, he said, the great powers, they will do what they will or what they can. But all the lesser powers will suffer what they must. And if ASEAN gets picked apart and is picked on by either the United States or China or any other potential great power, we will be the ones that suffer what we must. We need to pull together. And turning to Gwen's view on how ASEAN comes together in this, at the end of it all, although Jay is kind enough to say I'm a student of his in international studies and international affairs, I also remain an economist. And as an economist, I think about regional order as there being a supply of regional order and a demand for regional order. On the supply side, the great powers wish to provide their views on maybe slightly more authoritarian political structures, but respect for the marketplace. On the other hand, a constant narrative on individual freedoms and human rights, which in many Asian cities, many Asian countries, continues to sound grating to Asian ears. Those are the supply side. ASEAN is the demand side. ASEAN's preferences, ASEAN views articulated in an empowered way can help nudge the formation of alternative regional power configurations. And I believe, this is my optimism, I believe that we now recognize we are articulate, empowered consumers of potential regional orders. And it's by forming a coherent demand side that we can counter a malevolent Chinese presence and counter a malevolent American presence. We need to articulate what it is that we want and get from the great powers what we are able to attract. Let me finish by evoking once again Jay's wonderful analogy between what's happening Cold War 2.0 world order and what's happening within Thailand itself, the old order and the new order. See, because America, when it was founded, wrote a Declaration of Independence that said the government of the day works only with the consent of the governed. I want us to think about regional order, world order, trade relations. We need to think about where is the consent of the governed coming from. American hegemony might have benefited the world in creating the American century, the rules-based order. And that, at that time, consent of the governed was apparent. We all benefited from it. It is a different America out there today. That consent of the governed is no longer forthcoming. This is why ASEAN needs to step up. We need to provide the consent of the governed on the structure that emerges. This is why I'm optimistic. I think we will pull through.
Thank you very much. So I think there's a few thoughts there, and I wonder if either of you would like to respond to Danny's points.
Maybe just briefly, I noticed that Gwen has been a convert to be an ASEAN promoter now that you are Dean of the LKY. Your former Dean are also very optimistic about ASEAN as well. Maybe I wonder that's written in your term of reference when you take a job.
I can assure you, it is not in my job contract as Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School that I must support ASEAN.
You don't get free admission to all ASEAN summits.
It is from trying to understand what ASEAN is seeking to achieve and from thinking about the crumbling world order out there. The alternatives that are on offer aren't hugely attractive. But it is precisely when they aren't hugely attractive to the world that we realize there's a whole demand side to global order. It used to be, we thought that world order was determined only by great power competition, only by the competition and the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union, or now potentially the US and China. But it is at these moments that we realize the wonderful American idea of consent of the governed needs to come forward, needs to advance. I don't think it's wishful thinking. I think that we now have the architecture where we can build such a thing. We now have greater understanding in ASEAN, and we need to carry forward this positive narrative.
Can I actually ask you, Jake, because your view that Thailand will pursue a kind of conservative or minimalist kind of leadership approach in ASEAN this year, too much going on, but is there any possibility that Thailand could surprise us, as it often does, and pull rabbits out of a hat, or advance the kind of agendas we're talking about here, or even for that matter, Vietnam next year? I mean, can we be, do you think, are you optimistic about you weren't very sort of glowing about RCEP, but even a CPTPP, neither of which actually includes the US, so I'm not sure how useful that is in the current environment. But anyway, just looking at Thailand's prospects for leadership in this very important period for ASEAN.
Challenges are daunting, and they are clear. They are long, right? So everything from the trade front, RCEP, the future of world trade, more broadly, the CPTPP, who's in, who's out. If Thailand is going to consider TPP, CPTPP, is Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Brunei, Singapore. What about the others? And CPTPP could also expose cleavages among the ASEAN economies. So we have that to consider as well. The poorer countries like Laos, can Laos enter CPTPP? How about Myanmar? Why not them? So we have to be careful that CPTPP does not become divisive for ASEAN and exposes this disparity. I just want to have I'm conscious of audience time, and we want to turn the floor to the audience, but about ASEAN and the consent of the government of the governed that you mentioned. In good times, I tend to be an ASEAN skeptic. Good times meaning like the 1990s. ASEAN had a good run in the 1990s. It got all this APEC, and then AFTA, and then ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN +3, even in the economic crisis, and building on until the East Asia Summit, ADMM Plus, and all these ASEAN acronyms. So a good run. So in that time, I was more kind of a skeptic. But now I share a little bit of, I wouldn't say I'm an optimist, but I share the concern that we can't let ASEAN sink. We have to kind of show up ASEAN because we got nowhere else to go. So in that spirit, in that light, I think that they have to have more, the leadership, camaraderie, the behind border politics issues. They have to, like the Rohingya humanitarian disaster crisis, the dismantling, decimation of the opposition in Cambodia. How do we speak with a voice that is acceptable outside, but also within, across ASEAN? And consent of the governed. I've seen consent of the governed manufactured. Can also be massaged and managed. I think consent of the government has been managed. So that itself, I think, for ASEAN, you can see this in Cambodia, in a range across ASEAN. So, it points to the broader struggle about ways forward, going forward. Does ASEAN as a whole become more open and democratic with the consent of the government, or does it become a little bit more autocratic, authoritarian with manufactured and managed consent? That is consequential for how ASEAN will be.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll move to questions now, and we can take one round.
When I see the Americans, the arguments between America and China, on the American sides are mainly lawyers. On the Chinese side are mainly business people. And the rules in China are made by or based on the Communist Party. So the basis of the rules are different in China and America. And so maybe some conflicts originate from a different mindset. And America tries to be, emphasizes on the legal aspects, and America wants to enforce their laws on the rest of the world. So the Americans, let's say, canceled the agreement with Iran, and now if Europeans do not follow in line, they are sanctions. So this is a certain kind of world order, but is this a world order which is sustainable?
It seems to me that we've had many decades of strong growth which have been based upon really the demographic dividend that Thailand has had. And we're now reaching a phase where next year the UN projects that the working age population of Thailand will start to shrink. So this is really a critical moment, it seems, economically for Thailand, to see whether or not the economy can really push forward into services and Thailand 4.0 and becoming a higher income economy. I agree with Danny Quah that with the New World Disorder, it also seems that it's a critical moment for ASEAN to cooperate, work together, and build more transnational agreements. And it seems that it's really a critical moment for Thailand to do that also, given this the long-term economic trends. Do you think that the government really has the policy space to engage in this and to engage in ASEAN to bring Thailand to a higher growth path, to really engage in the Thailand 4.0 policies?
If Thailand is forced to choose between the US and China, which one do you think it will choose? Thank you.
I'm listening to the panelists and something that I'm glad that the takeaway is very clear that ASEAN need to be intentionally coming together. This is our agree. And this is for me is fait accompli because this is the only way to, I guess, maintain our way of life. Professor Kuan was talking about the process of demand and supply, which I find is very hard to understand. My thinking about that, what you're trying to deliver, is the process that will entrench us together. I, on the other hand, would like to propose that based on the fact that for ASEAN to really be able to maintain their way of life, it's very clear that our better friend in the north, most northern part of Asia, are more autocratic. Therefore, in order for us to maintain our way of life, we have to be more liberal or more democracy. It's clear that has to be the case. And if that is the case, the tools to go for that would be to follow the United Nations Declaration of Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 17. Use that as the center point of going about in all the Asian countries. And that automatically will set us into the path of better democratic system. That's one point. The second point
yes,
is...
and your question, sir.
Yeah, actually, I'm giving opinion. The second opinion is, we did not mention about another bloc who are in the conundrum position like us, the EU. On one side, they're afraid of Mr. Putin, which is now calling Mr. Xi as a best friend. And Mr. Xi, like vice versa, calling Mr. Putin best friend. And we, of course, are just a better friend. And for that reason, the Europeans are very lonely too. In order to forge the solidarity of the so-called better democracy movement, why can't we think about reaching out to the European to forge the further free trade agreement together? This is something I haven't heard. Thank you very much.
I'll just tell you my own view. It's striking that, you know, that as you say, the U.S. negotiating side is all lawyers, and the Chinese negotiating side in this trade, these negotiations, are either business community people or engineers. In fact, the political leadership going all the way back decades is China's bunch of engineers. America's presidents have historically been lawyers. So there's a deep-seated partition on that kind. I don't think I personally meant anything by my omission of saying rule of law. I try and stay away from that because there is an overhang from a different narrative where, you know, a previous narrative was that America would come around the rest of the world and say, with us, you get international rule of law, the rules-based order. With the other guys, you get the arbitrary exercise of power. So that sharply divided how people were, you know, as someone else was saying, if you had to choose between the US and China, which way would you go? I think the world has gotten a lot murkier on these rules, but I think that one ought to be able to write down a minimal set of rules that we can all agree are a good way forward. Almost as important as the precise nature of those rules is how we adhere to them, that there should be no moving the goalposts as we currently see happening, that the winner should behave with good grace and the loser should not pull out a gun to enforce an alternative outcome. And I think that it is possible for the world to come to a set of rules that we can all agree on that don't draw on a previous history of unhappy experience. I think that the suggestions from the back about using the Sustainable Development Goals as a way to think about carving out this set of rules is a good idea. And you recited to me SDG 17. Let me recite back SDG number 1. which is the eradication of poverty in all its manifestations. That is a fine goal for us to continue to strive towards, and arguably all different parts of the world have something to contribute on that. So let me leave for the others to pick up on these other sets of questions. We are hugely interested.
Yes, we should also get back maybe to the suggestion of pulling Europe more into
Yeah,
the...
I did want to come back.
Okay, we'll come back to that.
Okay. Yeah, we'd like to come back to you about the choice between US and China as well.
Well, that's your question.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it applies to...
Speak as a Thai.
It applies to
Okay,
Southeast
speak as
Asia.
a-
I mean, it applies to Southeast Asia. Look at, the more I see the US and China face off in negotiations, what I'm afraid is that, so the US is on the offensive, right? And China is on the defensive. So China is trying to accommodate and concede and this and that, and it's a tug of war back and forth. But what I'm afraid is that at some point, not in the distant future, China will just think that whatever it does won't be enough. And then when it thinks that whatever it does, whatever concession it makes won't be enough, it'll stop making them. That's when we have some real problems. So the two questions I want to just pick up on about the Thai economy and choosing between US and China. So Thai economy with the new government, we have space to do a lot more things now. I think with this post-election government such as it is, at least there's some basis to engage. So there's more space to do a range of things, trade policy, some new initiatives, and so I think that's that's something to look forward to, even though it comes from a kind of contested basis. The economy is going to look like this. It's going to look like it has been, but maybe with some upgrades. So if you look at the cabinet composition, first Thai economy expands about 3% a year on just momentum. And mainland Southeast Asia, the migrant workers from nearby. So I don't quite buy the demographic doom thesis. I think that all demographics in all countries are ultimately doomed. But for Thailand, it's bought off time by these millions, up to 4 million migrant workers from Myanmar, another 1.1 million from Cambodia. And so if you look at the Thai workforce, about 13% is from migrant labor. And that buys time on the demographic pressure. Now, Thai economy will expand based on its cheaper labor and so on. It has other problems. The drawback from cheaper labor is that the lack of structural change and the middle income trap and no upgrading and so on. But now we have a new government, so 3%-ish. There'll be a little bit more, a little bit giddier maybe, a little bit more optimism. There'll be new, for the first time, civilian leaders in some of these ministries from political parties, not from the military appointments. So if you look at, say, transport ministry, say commerce ministry, say industry, say ICT, energy, you see new endeavors. And these new endeavors will have the backside, it will have an underbelly of, shady dealings. But on the front side, at least there'll be some thrust on policy. But it will be fragmented. So it depends where you look. Transport will be very active. A lot of projects, they'll be very keen, very enthusiastic at the transport ministry, the new leadership. Foreign ministry is the key for this kind of audience, and we don't have a clear picture on that. Maybe the Democrat will get it, they're probably the most qualified. Energy, you see a lot of projects, and the underbelly will be also maybe something, untoward or unbecoming. But yet, there will be some policy momentum now with this post-election government. Before, you had a lot of policy inertia. The 4.0 came kind of late. All the upgrading pledges, the Eastern Seaboard, the Eastern Economic Corridor, a bit makeshift, and if it had been launched from the outset of the coup, it could have gained some traction. But it was launched almost, they see the election, they get the constitution, so they wanted some legitimacy. Oh, they realized, hey, it's election time. We better show some results, But now I think there's some, I don't want to say optimistic, but at least there'll be a positive change in terms of momentum, initiative, and some space. Between China and US, whichever side forces Thailand to choose, that side will likely lose in the long term. Unless the US-China face-off confrontation becomes across the board. So for example, in the Cold War, Thailand chose, and it chose the winning side. In the 1950s, before 1954, Thailand did not want to choose. Even in 1955, Thailand went to the Bandung Conference, having second thoughts about joining the US alliance, right? After signing the Manila Pact in 1954. In the mid-1950s, a lot of ambivalence among the policy elites. By 1962, it clearly chose, signed a communique between Rusk and Thanat Khoman, Dean Rusk and Thanat Khoman. But this time, it's not an open fight yet, so don't want to choose. If there's no open fight across the board, no choosing. If anybody forces China to choose, in the long run, I think that it will be counterproductive. So China will not force Thailand to choose. If someone forces Thailand to choose, likely it will be the US.
Can I just add my own little bit to that? You've said some very interesting things lately about an emerging kind of backdoor BRI approach, and therefore, we've seen Japan unusually start making, it's part of a new wave of minilateralism, right, in the region. We're seeing different alliances or not alliances, but groupings for different purposes. But in particular, I know you've been looking at that emergence of the Japan-China dynamic in third countries. Do you think if Thailand's sort of pressured to choose between China and the US, it's that simple that Japan is lumped into the US view, or do you think that actually that's also introducing a new factor in this supposed binary choice?
On record, so my writings have been very critical of China. On the South China Sea artificial islands, they've taken over its rocks and reefs and land features. They made this, eight of them, and they've weaponized them. In the Mekong region, where we are, they've built these 8 dams now, unilaterally. And so I've been very critical of China. And the Chinese support for Cambodia, the Cambodian government, undermining, really eliminating the opposition, Chinese support for coup makers in Thailand. I've been very critical of China on record. However, in the last year, 18 months, I've seen a lot of flexibility and pragmatism, smart pragmatism from Beijing. They're not rigid. And the Second Belt Road Forum, for example, if you read the Xi Jinping speech, it's really something. They are talking about green growth, that's sustainability, and that's sustenance. They're talking about inclusiveness, local views, and so they are adjusting. And then on top of it all, they're having this new model of cooperation. They call it third-party cooperation, third market. So the idea is that China's BRI is facing all this pushback, right? Maldives, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, no progress in Thailand. So it's not very popular, BRI, not very popular, has not been. So China then, with the tariffs, the trade war, technology war, is feeling some pinch and pain, I think, from that. So it's being forced to look at other ways. So there's a kind of a realignment, a very tentative realignment between China and Japan. And Japan, in a similar way, with Trump being so unpredictable and maybe mercurial and changeable, Japan cannot, in the long term, rely on this security guarantor. Right? So Japan has to look after itself. So it's got 2 aircraft carriers now in short order. It might change the constitution. So it's becoming a regular, normal country now with a regular, normal military. But Japan also has turned to China. You know, Abe went to China, to Beijing on a big trip last October and came away with 52, memoranda of cooperation, right? And one of the 52 is right here in Thailand. It's the pilot project. It's a front project. It is to build a smart city in Chonburi, and modeled after Yokohama, and then the Chinese city is I want to say Nanning, but it's not Nanning. Anyway, so China, Japan, Thailand, smart city, Chonburi, first of the major project, and China is looking at this in other ways. So it could be China, Thailand in Laos, China, Singapore in Myanmar. So this is kind of like entering the place through the back door or the side door, and it shows China's pragmatism. And they were just along the way. From the US, we have not seen that kind of pragmatism.
But do you think Thailand could see Japan as also
Japan
slightly separated from?
Japan has a big problem. Japan has a big dilemma because on the one hand, Japan is interested in doing more with China in Asia. Yet Japan is wary of China's dominance and BRI, and Japan is beholden to the US Treaty Alliance and the US security guarantee. And Trump is pressing Japan hard. So I think of all the countries, the major powers, US, you can see what they're going to do next. China, you can see what they're going to do next. Japan will have a big dilemma.
Thank you. Over to
Yeah.
Somkiat, and you might want to also address that very good question about the longer-term economic prospects of Thailand as well. But there's a lot for you to answer.
Yeah, sure. From the economic perspective, I think Thailand have to move up and move out. That's for prosperity. Move up, I mean, we have to keep up growing because we are not reaching the comfortable level of enjoying, retirement age, being mid-income country at the moment. So we have to move up, we have to grow. And I think I would have some different opinion with Jay that just having migrant labor would not be enough. My team calculation is that we need 3 million extra migrant workers per year to sustain the growth, considering the impact of the Thailand becoming an aging economy. 3 million extra per year, which is quite a lot. In 10 years, it will be half of our population.
That's to sustain your 3.5 to 4%
Exactly.
growth estimate, right?
Yeah.
So that's even just to sustain that.
Exactly. So we cannot just relying on migrant workers. We have to use more robotics automation system. And good news is that some leading Thai companies are already introducing automation robotics in their warehouse, in their factories, in their even in their office using software like robotic process automation (RPA). It's becoming quite common in Thai large companies. Smaller companies have yet to adopt that, but I'm sure they will take up that. And in order to move up, just being more efficient, being automated is not enough. We have to also be more innovative, which means we have to invest more in research and development. And gladly, 2 years ago, it was the first year that the Thai investment in research and development has reached 0.1 trillion baht for the first time, 100,000 ล้าน baht for the first time, and the share of private investment is around 80%, public is 20%, which is good news. We have to do a lot on that front. I agree with you that we are too late, we are doing too little, but we are doing something. And on moving out, I think Thailand is lucky enough not having to choose between China and US. We are lucky enough in the sense that we do not have any security issue with both countries or each country. Unlike Vietnam, Japan, Taiwan, which have some border conflicts, territorial conflicts with China. Thailand has no such problem. And we have no conflicts with the US politically. And economically speaking, we rely on both superpowers. US as the major consuming country, and China is also producing and consuming country. So we are too much interlinked between the two, with the two, so that it will be really awkward for us. It will be really difficult for us to choose. And I'm sure, I'm quite positive that we will not be forced to choose unless there is a full-fledged war, not only trade war. I don't see a scenario that we are forced to choose side in a trade war, in a tech war, or even in tech war, because we are not part of that, the crucial element. We are not producing, 3G, 5G chip like some Taiwanese company. So we are quite safe on that. We are fortunately on a much lower end of that production network. And by choosing both sides, at the same time, we have to keep comfortable distance from them as well. For example, we would like to attract more Chinese investment, we would like to attract more Chinese tourists, but at the same time, we have to be really careful when we implement certain infrastructure projects that can be integrated as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. For example, the high-speed rail. I think the outgoing government is doing moderately okay in terms of securing breathing space and policy space for the Thai high-speed rail by not relying on Chinese loan. At the beginning, the northeastern high-speed rail link was supposed to be funded by loan from Chinese government and Japanese government. But at the end, we found out that it's not of good condition. So, and we are not too small. We have some surplus to fund the project ourselves. And by that, we can choose the pace of the project. We can choose more or less of the technology rather than relying on too much on either side. I don't think Thailand is in a position to be too distant from both superpowers. So we have to be careful on that. And having an FTA with the EU, why not? It's part of the strategy to reach out. If the condition has a good term, why not?
Well, because that has been under negotiation for so many years, and it's sort of become a little bit like, will it never happen?
The stumbling block is that we are not democratically elected, right? Now that more or less we have elected government, so we can. I think the EU would be happy to.
So do you think it could be another one of your canaries in the coal mine if
that's,
Thailand can pull off an
yeah.
EU FTA? Do either of you have thoughts about the Europe question? Is it time to reach out for more to Europe well, not just Thailand, ASEAN?
I'll just be very short. I want to give the last word to Professor Quah. So Thailand has been, it's almost an axiom now, cliche to say that we've been punching below our weight. Right? And that's shooting ourselves in the foot. So I think that going forward now with the post-election government, I wouldn't even call it the elected government, I'll just say post-election government. At least there'll be some space for policy initiative, and depending on where you look. The pity of it all is that Thailand has a lot of talented people. I mean, the country doesn't lack talent, but it's just been stuck between this established order and interests and institutions and the new politics that has to emerge because of pressure from below. So I would say that going forward with the post-election government, we will do a little bit less of that, a little bit less of shooting ourselves in the foot, a little bit less of punching below the weight. Thailand will still not punch its weight. It will certainly not punch above its weight. But at least compared to the last 5 years, there's space to do a bit better.
For the final word.
Thank you. No pressure, right?
No pressure at all.
Right. If I may just make 2 quick points.
You can waffle on as much.
First is just to respond, actually to build on something that Jay said. that's really important. And that is, given the way the conversation is going between the US and China, at some point, China might say, I'm never going to be able to do anything to please you. I'm just going to have to walk away. And the world will be completely different. So, but before we get to that point, I think China will do a few things. It will almost certainly work on reducing state subsidies and diminishing the importance of state-owned enterprises. Arguably, that's something that the Chinese leadership itself wants. You know, Steve Bannon doesn't think so. Steve Bannon thinks that what keeps the Chinese Communist Party going is its engagement with the state-owned enterprises. But look, Xi Jinping listened to his people and said, you want no corruption? We'll work on giving you no corruption. This is an autocracy that's not open to the usual system, democratic mechanisms that we've got, but they listened. There's also the same kind of middle class and entrepreneurial energy moving against state-owned enterprises. My prediction is China will listen to what America says and says, you want us to reduce the importance of state-owned enterprises? Okay, we'll do that. It will be, as the Chinese like to say, win-win. America gets the win, the Chinese Communist Party gets the win. Intellectual property rights? Look, the fact of the matter is China's technology on artificial intelligence, quantum computing, finance digitization is already ahead of a lot of the rest of the world. It, like every other country we've seen in human history, is moving from copying to producing its own technology. And as with every other country that's made that transition, it will begin to emphasize intellectual property rights. So it will say to America, you want stronger intellectual property rights? Okay, we'll give you stronger intellectual property rights. But there are many other things China will just not be able to give up. Right? The way, the importance of the Chinese Communist Party, the different interpretation of human rights, the different interpretation of individual liberties. That, I mean, we like to think about how, you know, nations have an essence to them. That's part of what the essence of the Chinese nation now is. It will never be able to give up this. But then, if it comes to pass, we get to that point, then we have to think, what will the world look like if it bifurcates? The first implication is that there will be a huge loss of trust everywhere. You know, we talked earlier about US and rule of law. The United States has walked away from the world, from the American century, the rules-based order that it built. Huge loss of trust. We will have a bifurcated trading system, a bifurcated technology system. And actually, unhappy though we might be with that, it might be livable. We already have a bifurcated, trifurcated technology system in that Linux doesn't talk to Microsoft Windows, doesn't talk to Mac OS. We build APIs, application programming interfaces, that try and negotiate that. We will try and do the same with different internet systems out there. And we kind of are already moving in that direction with the way different parts of the world interpret data privacy. Europe believes a certain way about personal protection of data. India and China and the rest of Asia, we have a completely different interpretation. America has a different interpretation. So if the world bifurcates on technology so that my Huawei phone cannot get its Android updates, we'll be okay. We'll have a different system. It's not as good as a system where we're integrated, but we'll be okay. So then how does the world bifurcate? This is not a suggestion to anybody on how you run it, but this is a prediction. My prediction is look at who trades with whom. Still, a lot of countries, US trade is hugely important. For Thailand, Thailand's trade with the United States was 6% of GDP 20 years ago. Today it's 10%. China's, the US is doing well with its trade relations with Thailand. But Thailand's trade with China is now 20% of Thai GDP. Canada's trade with the United States is 46% of Canada's GDP. Mexico's trade with the United States is over 50% of its GDP. So my prediction on the bifurcation is look at who trades with whom. And it will be a world that's not necessarily as good as the one where we're all in a rules-based order, everyone agrees this is the right way forward. There's a system for resolving trade disputes that everyone can agree with. But the problem is the people who have the power to continue to effect that system are no longer interested in effecting that system from the West. China continues to promote the idea of globalization, and we will have to see if the rest of it, its ongoing changes, the rest of the world finds acceptable. It will be a calculation of cost and benefit. And that is the kind of world I suspect we're going to have to start navigating in. ASEAN can play a huge role in this. ASEAN needs to play a huge role.
Well, I think on that note, we're just about out of time, and I think we've had really excellent insights into many of the key questions facing not just this country but the region, and really want to thank Professor Quah for coming over from Singapore, and also our excellent speakers, Thai speakers. So unless you want to add something, Thitinan, as director. And
Just thank you, Gwen. Our next event will be on the 27th in the morning. I think there's a flyer outside. We're going to launch a book about Kunanan Panyarashun, but we're going to tease out insights, issues, and prospects for this particular environment and government.
Okay, thank you very much all for coming, and thank you to our speakers.